Chapter 2 is looking at how we can evaluate scientific claims, and we're going to be following a mother as she peels back the controversy to decide whether or not to vaccinate her children. So first we're going to look and see how vaccines work, what they have done for our society, and then we'll get into how we can evaluate different scientific claims using this vaccination story to help us understand these concepts and help us make decisions. Vaccines work by having an individual get an injection, and the vaccine is going to be a harmless form of a virus or another organism like a bacteria that is injected under our skin. Once we get that injection or we get that shot, the vaccine is going to stimulate our immune system to produce antibodies. And these antibodies are shown as the green Y-shaped structures. And these antibodies are going to recognize the virus. Then the next time, if we are exposed to that virus after we get our vaccination, those new antibodies that our body produced as a result of that vaccine are already primed. So that means they are already ready to go to attack that invader. So vaccines allow our bodies to respond to viruses and bacteria faster so that we can start fighting off these disease organisms before they start to make us sick. And vaccines have saved a lot of lives since they were discovered. So before we had vaccines, children died in very large numbers from things like smallpox, diphtheria, whooping cough, also known as pertussis, polio, and a lot of other infectious diseases. And this is showing, for example, we can look at smallpox. So in the 1600s, about 70% of Native Americans were killed from smallpox. That eventually went down, and now in the last 18 years, we have had no incidents of smallpox in the U.S. So vaccines have cut down on the number of deaths, particularly in children. But in the media lately, we have heard a lot of stories about vaccines causing autism or other types of issues. And these are referred to as anecdotal stories. So over here, we can also see there's a text. So someone's saying, I'll give you a source, a personal source. I'm 46. I've not had a vaccine since 6th or 7th grade. And guess what? I'm fine, other than an autoimmune disease, but no vaccines prevent diseases. And I had chickenpox and I'm still alive. So this is an example of an anecdotal story. So it's one person telling their individual story. It's not based on research or any type of scientific evidence. So are these types of evidence good in order to understand and to use to make decisions about our healthcare or other decisions about our lives? So in order to evaluate claims, whether if it's an anecdotal story, if it's picked up by the media, we have to understand a couple of terms. So one is a scientific claim. So a scientific claim, it's a statement about how the world works, and it can be tested using the scientific method. Examples of scientific claims: all living things are composed of cells. We can test that using the scientific method. The company that made these very popular running shoes, the 5-finger running shoes, they made health claims. So we can actually give people these running shoes and see if those health claims are true using that scientific method. Another scientific claim, which again is very popular right now, is looking at vaccines causing autism or other issues in children. In order to look at these different claims, we are going to be focusing on scientific literacy. So this is an understanding of the basics of science and the scientific process. And this is what I really want you to get out of this course. Just understanding the basics of biology, understanding how research is done so that you are able to make informed decisions about the world around you. so that you are able to make decisions about your healthcare, decisions about your family's healthcare, use it to make decisions on how you vote, etc. And we also want this to enable us to be able to communicate our knowledge to others, to just become informed citizens. One thing that we look at when we look at a scientific claim, and this falls under our literacy or our understanding of science and the scientific process. One thing we look at are credentials. So credentials are any type of qualification, achievement, personal quality, or aspect of a person's background, and it's typically used to indicate that a person is suitable for something. So when we look at the credentials of a scientist, we want them to be educated. We want them to have experience within that field that they're researching. So those are examples of credentials. So when you read something, you want to look and see if that person has the proper credentials to be telling you scientific information. Another thing that we need to be aware of is any type of bias. A bias is a prejudice or opinion for or against something. And this is usually based on personal experiences, based on anecdotal evidence. And a lot of times it is not based on scientific claims or scientific facts or research. There are different types of research that can be done using the scientific method. One is called basic research. Basic research is intended to expand the fundamental knowledge of science, and it's largely funded by the federal government. So this is research that is done just for the sake of increasing our body of knowledge within science. Another type of research is called applied research. This is where businesses and industries, they provide the majority of funding to find practical uses for scientific discoveries. So we are trying to find something and we're going to apply it to solve some problem that we are facing within our world. Money is a very strong motivator to support or reject a claim. So these applied research experiments are usually funded by companies or industries that have a financial incentive to find use for that research that they are working on. This research that is done needs to be published or communicated within the scientific community or within the general media. The first type of communication tool that we're going to look at is called primary literature. This is the first publication of scientific research that contains the actual data, it contains the control, it contains the materials and methods that were used to do the research. Another big part of this includes that peer review part. And we talked about peer review quite a bit in the first chapter. So this means that other scientists have checked the data, they've checked the experimental design, the controls, before publication is allowed into these primary literature journals. So examples of these include the Journal of American Medical Association, the Ecological Society of America, Science, and Nature. This first publication of the research is then picked up by our second type of literature called secondary literature. These are sources that give a basic overview of the topic. They don't include all of the data, all of the research methods, or the experimental design. They just summarize the results and conclusions. These include things like the New York Times, so a newspaper, Popular Science, Discover Magazine, National Geographic. In secondary literature, you want to make sure that the credentials of the author or the sources are good, that we have proper education and qualifications, and that there are no biases within the secondary literature sources. The last type of source is social media. This is not a good source for scientific information due to lack of credentials and lack of peer review by scientists. You do not know who is behind the social media. They can make false claims on social media, and this includes everything from Instagram, Twitter, Reddit, and Facebook, and any other type of social media that is out there. So to put these three different types of publications up here, and we have on the top, we have increasing confidence of scientific claims. So social media has the lowest amount of confidence. Though secondary literature are in the middle, and primary literature has the highest amount of confidence. But to go along with that confidence in the scientific claims, the more confident you are in those scientific claims, the harder that research is to read. So for example, things on Twitter, very short, very to the point, very easy to read, but you can't trust them. The New York Times, National Geographic, a little bit more challenging to read, but those scientific claims are more confident. And primary literature is very, very difficult to read if you are unfamiliar with the research area, but the claims being made in primary literature are very strong. To go along with looking at where information has been published, whether if it's in primary literature or on social media, we also need to look at that data and understand correlation versus causation. So when one event follows another, the first event may or may not be caused by the second event. So if we go back to the vaccine example, so a big hot topic in the media today is that vaccines cause autism. And this came from a study called the Wakefield study. And this scientist found that 8 out of 12 children experienced symptoms of autism after having received an MMR vaccine, so a measles, mumps, and rubella vaccine. So Wakefield, the researcher, suggested that the MMR vaccine might cause autism. And this is the whole study that the anti-vaccination people use to tell others to not vaccinate their children. But there are a lot of problems in this study. Problems from the Wakefield study include a lot of things. So the first one, they only looked at 12 individuals. That is a very, very small sample size and not good to make claims with. They did not have a random sample of children. The study had no control group, which is a big thing in experimental design that we saw in the first chapter. Their findings could not be replicated by other scientists. Therefore, the science is not trustworthy. It did not go through proper experimental design in order to make certain claims. So instead of this research showing a causation that the MMR vaccine causes autism, this is more of a correlation. So a correlation is when two or more aspects of the natural world, they behave in a way where they look like they are related to each other, but they are not. There's no cause for these two aspects to be related. So linking autism to an MMR vaccine is a correlation. They're just related to each other. It was not shown that MMR vaccine causes autism. Another example of this, and this is a bit silly, is looking at the graph up here. So on this chart, we have time on the x-axis, which is summer. So we have April, May through September. And this is showing that the number of shark attacks increases over time. Along with that, the number of ice cream sales also increases over time. So from this, some people might claim that as you sell more ice cream, the number of shark attacks increases, that they are related to each other or they're caused by each other. But we know that ice cream sales and shark attacks are not related to each other. It just happens by chance that these two aspects are showing a correlation. And these two aspects could be related to something else. Specifically, they're related to the temperature. So temperature makes more sense. As the temperature increases, people buy more ice cream. And as the temperature increases throughout the year, people go to the beach more, so the number of shark attacks increases. So we really have to take a look at correlation versus causation. So are those two things causing each other, or are they just correlated with each other? So here's another example of autism and organic food. So linking autism to the increase in the consumption of organic foods, this is another example of a correlation. So over time, the number of individuals diagnosed with autism is going up, and the sales in organic food is also going up. So when we look at this data, could we say that organic food causes autism? See, this is another example of correlation and not causation. So this leads into looking at, is the science or those scientific claims real? Is it real science? Did it go through the scientific method? Was there an experiment that could be tested, that could be reproduced, that made sense? Or is this pseudoscience? And pseudoscience is characterized by scientific sounding statements, beliefs, or practices that are not based on the scientific method. And this chart shows some examples of this. So if we start at the very top, in real science, we have an initial observation that we can collect data off of. In pseudoscience, this is based off phenomenon or anecdotal evidence, things that cannot be measured. Another example of this is looking at if our experiment was carefully designed, if it has all the variables we talked about, an experimental group, a control group, we identify our independent and dependent variables. If all of those are good, then that's real science. If our science does not meet that criteria, then it is pseudoscience. So when your data is anecdotal, poorly described, the results are not repeatable, this is bad science or pseudoscience. So you can take a look at this chart in your book to help you make decisions on if the science or if those claims are real or if they're pseudoscience. So pulling all of this together, there are 4 kind of sections that we want to look at when we are evaluating a scientific claim. One of them we talked about is the peer review. So we want to make sure that the publications we're looking at have been peer reviewed, and we also want to look at what type of book they have been published in, if they're published in a scientific journal. Another one, credentials. We want to make sure that the person making the claims has been trained, if they have experience within that research area. Biases or agendas. Does the person making the scientific claim hold a belief that will support the claim? Is there money involved that will influence the claim? And the last part is looking at if that science is real or if it's pseudoscience. So does that claim, does that research follow the scientific method, or does it not follow that scientific method? There are different types of studies that we can look at. Strong study types include the following list. So one of them is a meta-analysis. This is analysis of the combined results of several studies. So this is done when we are going to heavily support a hypothesis. They take several different research studies, pull all of those results together to make a more broad claim. Another study type, a cohort study. These are observational studies of a group of people over a period of time. So a cohort is a group of people that goes through the same study for multiple years. So this can be done on twins, for example, to look and see how twins are related to each other, how their genetics, how their environment influence their behaviors. So they'll follow them over a long period of time. There are case-controlled studies. These are studies that compare patients with a disease to patients that do not have the disease. And also peer-reviewed studies. This is research that has been evaluated by peer researchers before publication. So these are different types of studies that we can use to help us make decisions in our personal lives. So these are studies that we can use to increase our scientific literacy. So the Wakefield study that claims that the MMR vaccine causes autism has been retracted due to it not fitting into the different criteria of evaluating a scientific claim. So even though the General Medical Council concluded that this Wakefield study was irresponsible and dishonest, for some reason its conclusions that MMR vaccines cause autism still play a big role in forming public opinion. So part of scientific literacy is understanding that the study has been retracted and informing others about the study. So we can use our scientific literacy, the things that we learn in this class, and the things that we have learned about the scientific method and how we can evaluate scientific claims. We use this to make informed choices. So life choices involve more than just science, although you should take this into consideration. We also have to include values, ethics, religion are an important part of making our decision. And then our choices can affect others in our community. So we have to understand the choices that we make, why we are making those choices based on our scientific literacy, our values and morals, and also how this influences the other people around us. So one thing with vaccines, why everybody should be vaccinated as long as they are able to, is herd immunity. So this occurs when a critical portion of the population is vaccinated, and this will help stop the spread of the disease. It will contain the spread of that disease. This is showing what can happen in different situations. So up the top, we have a population of individuals where no one is vaccinated. So when no one is vaccinated, but for an outbreak, we have people in blue that are healthy, they're not vaccinated. People in red are sick and contagious. So if no one is vaccinated, those sick and contagious people are going to pass on that disease to all of the unvaccinated individuals. So this disease is going to spread very rapidly through the population. In another example, if some people are vaccinated in the yellow, so we have blue people that are not vaccinated, yellow people that are, and red people that have a contagious disease. Those people that are not vaccinated are going to pick up that disease, so the disease is still going to spread, but not as much. Those vaccinated people are still safe. So herd immunity happens when the majority of people are vaccinated. So this is going to cut down on the spread of that disease. So if we have the majority of the people vaccinated in the yellow, we have 2 people that are sick and 2 people that are not vaccinated. Those not vaccinated people can still get the disease, it'll spread, but that disease does not spread as much. So more people will survive, they will not get sick. So this is that herd immunity. So when parents do not vaccinate their children, that herd immunity disappears, and infectious diseases that were once thought to be eliminated are coming back. epidemic, and we are seeing this with measles, especially in Minnesota. So we are having a lot of children getting diseases because they do not have their vaccinations. So becoming scientifically literate can help prevent these illnesses from spreading through the population by informing others about the importance of vaccinations and really understanding how those vaccinations work. So looking at vaccinations, that is one example of how we can use scientific literacy to help our communities and to help people survive and not get sick from these different diseases. You can also use scientific literacy to help solve other issues within our society or within our environment.